Welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing multiple sclerosis. Okay, so in the previous video we went over the basics of multiple sclerosis. We discussed that multiple sclerosis is an autoimmune disease in which the body's own immune system is going to attack white matter tissue within the central nervous system. And remember, the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. But remember, you don't get any attack on the white matter tissue of the peripheral nervous system in multiple sclerosis. So in an individual suffering with multiple sclerosis, over time you progressively get more and more white matter lesions forming, which are these areas of the white matter of the central nervous system that have been attacked by the immune system. And as I said in the previous video, when we come on to pathophysiology, I will try and give you a good reason for why it's only discrete bits of white matter that actually get attacked by this autoimmune disease. Why doesn't all the white matter all get attacked at once? We'll try and justify that later when we come on to discussing pathophysiology. Now, when a portion of white matter gets attacked by multiple sclerosis, it no longer functions correctly, and therefore people with multiple sclerosis can get a great plethora of symptoms because they can get dysfunction in all sorts of different neurological systems that the brain and spinal cord control. So you can get a huge number of different symptoms in multiple sclerosis, and of course the symptoms that an individual with multiple sclerosis gets will depend on where the white matter lesions that they have within their central nervous system actually have formed. So in two different people with multiple sclerosis, they might have white matter lesions in very different areas, and therefore they're likely to have very different symptoms. So I'm listing off a great list of symptoms, or I'm going to list off a great list of symptoms. And in an individual with multiple sclerosis, they won't necessarily have all of these, they'll have a collection of these depending on where the white matter lesions have formed. Okay, so we've been over the sensory symptoms that people with multiple sclerosis can get, and these are mainly going to occur because of lesions to the spinal cord or the brainstem. So we've talked about the fact that you can get numbness in certain areas of the body, so you can't feel anything in certain areas of the body. You can get paresthesia in certain areas of the body, which is strange pins and needles tingling sensation coming from certain areas of the body, and you can get pain coming from certain areas of the body. And this has to do with the fact that the white matter that is involved in transmitting up sensory signals from certain areas of the body can be affected by the white matter lesions. Remember, the white matter lesions in the brain and spinal cord, they don't cause nociceptive pain. You don't actually get pain specifically because of the inflammatory process occurring within the white matter. And remember, that's because the brain is not innervated by nociceptors, but you can get neuropathic pain, which is where you've interrupted the white matter that is involved in transmitting pain signals up to the brain in the spinal cord and the brainstem. And this now dysfunctions and starts sending aberrant signals up to the brain, which the brain interprets as pain coming from a certain area of the body. So people with multiple sclerosis, they can have neuropathic pain, but they don't get nociceptive pain because of the white matter lesions. That's a very important point to understand. Right, let's move on to something new. So we've done sensory. The next major category of symptoms is going to be motor symptoms. So one of the major functions of the nervous system, of course, is to sense information coming from the environment. Another one is to move the body, motor function. So let's now talk about how motor function can be affected by multiple sclerosis. So, of course, multiple sclerosis can cause paralysis of certain areas of the body. So I'll put this here. So it can lead to paralysis of certain areas of the body. And the reason for this is, again, if you imagine getting a lesion in the either the brainstem or the spinal cord, this could affect the communication of information coming from the brain which is going down to the muscles. So let me explain this in a little bit more detail. So, let's go to our little man here. It's always good to do an example. So let's say our little man wants to lift up his left arm here. So he wants to move up his left arm and maybe he wants to wave to someone. To do that, the brain takes a decision that it wants to make that movement and it sends information down the brainstem, down the spinal cord, and then the spinal cord will send that information to the peripheral nervous system, and the peripheral nervous system will communicate it to the actual muscle cells and make the muscles of the arm actually move so that he makes that movement. If you get lesions forming within the brainstem or the spinal cord that interrupt the flow of that signal from the brain to the peripheral nervous system to make the movement, then of course you can lose the ability to actually move certain parts of your body. So if you got a white matter lesion that affected the communication of motor information from the brain down to the peripheral nervous system that controls the left arm, for instance, then you might get paralysis of your left arm. So, interruption of the flow of information, this time down from the brain to the peripheral nervous system by a lesion to the brainstem or the spinal cord, could lead to paralysis. So it's effectively the equivalent of numbness, but of course numbness was to do with information coming up, and paralysis is to do with information coming down. Now, a slightly watered down version of paralysis is you might get muscle weakness rather than full-on paralysis. So paralysis, of course, means that you're actually incapable of moving a certain portion of the body, whereas weakness means that it's very, very difficult to move a certain area of the body, so you can only move it very, very weakly. So, in many people with multiple sclerosis, they might not get full-on paralysis of a certain area of their body, but they certainly get weakness of a certain area of their body. And again, the justification for why this can happen is exactly the same. So, if you get lesions in the brainstem and the spinal cord that affects the transmission of information from the brain down to control the nerves of the peripheral nervous system that control muscles in a certain area of the body, then that portion of the body, you're not going to be able to move it as effectively anymore. And it might not cause full-on paralysis, but it certainly is going to lead to big problems in moving that certain area of the body. So we can say that certain areas of the body can become weak because the brain's no longer able to send signals down to control that portion of the body as effectively because of lesions to the spinal cord. So, these two motor symptoms, paralysis and weakness, are very simple to understand. They're a problem with the transmission of information down from the brain to the peripheral nervous system through the brainstem and the spinal cord. Now I'm going to talk about a little bit more of a complicated motor symptom, which I'll put here. And this is something called dyspraxia. So let me explain what dyspraxia means. So dyspraxia is more complicated than paralysis and weakness. Dyspraxia is a problem up in the brain this time, rather than in the brainstem and spinal cord. It's a problem with actually creating the correct pattern of action potentials to create a movement. So again, it's best to actually go back to an example. So let's have our picture of the central nervous system here in our man. So again, let's say that our man wants to wave his left hand. So he wants to make a certain movement. In order for this movement to be made, the brain has to actually generate a pattern of action potentials in lots of different neurons coordinated over time that it's actually going to send down the brainstem and the spinal cord, which is then going to be relayed to the nerves of the peripheral nervous system. Now, there's a very fancy term that we use for that pattern of action potentials, and that's called a motor plan. So the brain is involved in creating these motor plans, and dyspraxia represents an inability to create these motor plans. So let me just explain this in a little bit more detail. So, if we want to wave our left hand then, that requires you to contract loads and loads of muscles in your arm, in your upper limb here, and it requires you to be contracting them all to the right degree at the right time. So it's an incredible maneuver, effectively. Loads of muscles have to contract to exactly the right amount at exactly the right time. To do that, that requires the motor neurons that innervate those muscle cells to be firing the right frequency of action potentials at the right time. So we require an incredible pattern of action potential firing by loads and loads of neurons that are innervating all of these different muscle cells of the muscles of the upper limb. And they all have to be coordinated in time as well, so it requires an incredible pattern of action potentials going down loads of different motor neurons over a certain amount of time. Okay? Those motor neurons of the peripheral nervous system, those do what the spinal cord tells them to do. So this means that we need an incredible pattern of action potentials coming down the neurons that are in the brainstem and the spinal cord, which are communicating with the motor neurons of the peripheral nervous system. And to generate that incredible pattern of action potentials coming down the brainstem and the spinal cord, that's what the brain has to do. So the brain creates that incredible pattern of action potentials going down loads of different neurons over a certain period of time, and that's what we refer to as a motor plan, that incredible pattern of action potentials in a bunch of neurons that will actually produce a certain movement. And if you get lesions in certain areas of the brain, this can damage your ability to create motor plans, to create these perfect patterns of action potentials, to create movements. And this is what is meant by dyspraxia. So dyspraxia means that you have problems actually creating the motor plans to move. So it's not that you're paralyzed or that you've got weakness of certain areas of the body, it's that you've got an inability to actually generate the motor plans to make movements. So it's a more complicated motor symptom, and it's going to result from white matter lesions up in the brain rather than white matter lesions in the brainstem and the spinal cord. Okay, so those are motor symptoms then that people with multiple sclerosis can suffer with. Next, let's move on to visual symptoms that people with multiple sclerosis can get. So how can multiple sclerosis affect vision? So visual symptoms. So multiple sclerosis can actually affect the optic nerves, the nerves that come out of the back of the eyes and communicate information to the brain, visual information to the brain. Now, this seems like a bit of a paradox because I said that multiple sclerosis does not affect the peripheral nervous system, it only affects the central nervous system. However, you can view the optic nerves actually as an extension of the central nervous system. The optic nerves are not viewed as being part of the peripheral nervous system. Later on, when we come on to the pathophysiology of multiple sclerosis, we'll explore this in more detail. The optic nerves, the myelin that is around the axons in the optic nerves is the same as the myelin that is around the axons in the central nervous system. It's not the same as the myelin that is around the axons in the peripheral nervous system. So the optic nerves, we really do view them as an extension of the central nervous system. We don't think of them as part of the peripheral nervous system, and therefore they can be affected in multiple sclerosis. So just to add them onto this picture here, so I'll get another colour for this. So we'll have them in purple. So the optic nerves, where are they in this picture? Well, of course, the eyes will be in this position, of the left eye will be in this sort of position here. So coming out of the back of it, you then have the optic nerve. So the optic nerve will be in this sort of position, going into the brain like so. And there would, of course, be a right optic nerve on the other side as well. So from each of the eyes, come back the optic nerves. And I'll just label those up there. So in purple, that is the optic nerve. So, unfortunately, if you have multiple sclerosis, one of the areas where you can get a lesion occurring is within the optic nerve, and you can get this either on one side or, if you're very unlucky, on both sides. And this can have serious consequences for vision. So coming down to here then. So one of the things that can happen then in multiple sclerosis is a condition called optic neuritis. So whenever you see itis on the end of something, that means inflammation. The immune response is occurring in that place. So optic neuritis refers to inflammation of the optic nerve. So, people with multiple sclerosis, they can suffer with inflammation of the optic nerve. The immune response, the autoimmune response has attacked the optic nerve and is causing inflammation to occur there. It's causing a white matter lesion within one of the optic nerves. And this actually is one of the quite common things that can happen to people with multiple sclerosis. It's not, I'm afraid, a rare thing to occur. A lot of people with multiple sclerosis do get an episode of optic neuritis, where a lesion has formed within that optic nerve. Okay, so what symptoms does having a white matter lesion within one of your optic nerves actually produce? Well, it's obviously going to affect the communication of visual information from the eye to the brain. So it can produce problems with vision in that eye that's affected. So it can cause what we can call partial visual loss, or it can cause full visual loss in that eye. So depending on how severe the lesion is, it can either just damage vision to some degree. You might lose vision in a certain part of space with that eye, or everything might go a little bit blurry, or you might lose vision completely in that eye. So it can lead to what we call monocular blindness. So complete loss of vision within the affected eye. So within the eye for which the optic nerve has been affected. Okay, so you can get partial visual loss, or you can get monocular blindness if you're very, very unlucky due to the optic neuritis. The other thing to say that optic neuritis can cause is it actually does lead to nociceptive pain. So let me just explain this. So we talked about how most of these white matter lesions that form in multiple sclerosis don't lead to nociceptive pain, i.e. you're not getting pain because of the actual lesion forming in that area of white matter. However, in the case of the optic nerve, if you get a lesion forming in the optic nerve, this does activate pain receptors because the optic nerves do have nociceptors within them. So, the optic nerves here, in my picture, they do have nociceptors present within them, and when you get a lesion forming in one of those optic nerves, this will activate those nociceptors, and therefore you do get pain in the eye that has been affected. They get a very, very sharp, very horrible pain that doesn't go away until the lesion has settled down in that eye. Now, a little bit of terminology then for you. When you have a nerve, such as the optic nerve, that has nociceptors innervating the actual nerve, and I might just draw a little picture of this. So here is our optic nerve, drawn much bigger now. So remember, this will be made up of absolutely loads of axons, all running in parallel with one another, communicating information from the eyeball to the central nervous system. Now, around the nerve then, so in the border of the nerve, so all the axons are in the middle, but around the outside of it, what you will have is some nociceptors, like so. So this can be a nociceptor, and here then is its axon going like so. So in the border of the optic nerve, and indeed in the border of lots of nerves in the peripheral nervous system, you have nociceptors, and these are called nervi nervosum. So nervi, and I apologise, nervorum is the correct term, not nervi nervosum. So nervi nervorum is the name for these nociceptors in the wall of the optic nerve. Now, loads of nerves in the peripheral nervous system also have nervi nervorum. It's not just a feature of the optic nerve, but of course, this is rare considering that the optic nerve is considered part of the central nervous system. So the optic nerve is complicated. It has features that make us think it's part of the central nervous system, and then it has features that make us think it's part of the peripheral nervous system. The nervi nervorum are a feature that makes it similar to nerves in the peripheral nervous system. The fact that the myelin is the same sort of type of myelin as you have within the central nervous system is an argument to think of it as part of the central nervous system, and overall the arguments to think of it as part of the central nervous system are stronger than the arguments to think of it as part of the peripheral nervous system. So we do consider the optic nerves as part of the central nervous system, but be aware that they do have nervi nervorum in their border, and that this is the reason that when you get a white matter lesion occurring within one of your optic nerves, it triggers a lot of pain. Okay, so optic neuritis can occur in multiple sclerosis, and this can lead to either partial visual loss or full monocular blindness, and it also leads to a lot of nociceptive pain, so you get agony coming from the affected eye. Okay, let's change colour because I'm getting a little bit bored of the blue here, so let's change to green. So we've now been through sensory symptoms that people with multiple sclerosis can get, we've been through motor symptoms, we've been through visual symptoms. Let's now talk about speech. How can speech be affected by multiple sclerosis? And this is actually very similar to motor symptoms of multiple sclerosis, except that we're now talking, of course, about controlling the muscles of the voice box, of the larynx, to control speech, and also of your tongue, of course. But it is fundamentally really a subset of motor symptoms, but we'll consider it separately because it's so important. Okay, so let's talk about how speech can be affected in multiple sclerosis. So, people with multiple sclerosis can get what we call a dysarthria, and this is analogous to paralysis and weakness in the motor symptoms here. So, a dysarthria is where you can still talk, but your speech is very slurred, your speech is very difficult to understand. So someone who is dysarthric, and that's the adjective, so take off the A and put a C there, you would describe someone with a dysarthria as dysarthric. So someone who is dysarthric, they can still speak, however, when you're talking to them, it can be very difficult to understand what they are saying. Their words will not be formed properly. They will be trying their best to communicate to you, but their words might be very, very slurred and very difficult to understand. So this is caused by lesions to the brainstem and the spinal cord. So again, very analogously to when we were talking about how we move other portions of our body, when we want to speak, the brain has to come up with a motor plan effectively. It has to come up with an incredible pattern of action potentials that will make the muscles of the larynx and the muscles of the tongue move in the correct way to actually produce the speech that we want to produce. Then, once that motor plan for speech has been created up in the brain, it then has to be relayed downwards. So it has to go down the brainstem and potentially a little bit of the spinal cord, and then it will be communicated out to the peripheral nervous system, and the neurons of the peripheral nervous system will then control the actual muscles of the voice box and the tongue and make them move in the correct way to produce that speech. So a dysarthria is produced by problems with the transmission of the motor plan downwards. So lesions, for instance, in the brainstem might produce a dysarthria. Problems basically with the conduction of the motor plan downwards will produce disturbances to it, which will then make you not produce the correct sounds, so that your speech is very, very difficult to understand. But they will be trying their best to speak. They will be speaking at the same normal pace as they had before. It's just that it's very, very difficult now to understand them because the motor plan is not being communicated down to the peripheral nervous system whole and undamaged. It's being damaged because of white matter lesions, and therefore they're not actually moving the muscles of their larynx and their tongue in the quite correct way to produce lovely articulate speech, and instead it might come out very slurred and very difficult to understand. So that's what we mean by dysarthria. Then the more complicated speech symptom is very analogous to dyspraxia, and it's what we call dysphasia. And if someone was suffering with a dysphasia, you would describe them as dysphasic. So again, take off the A and put the C. And indeed, dyspraxia, you can describe someone suffering with dyspraxia as dyspraxic. would be the adjective. So what now is dysphasia? Dysphasia is a problem up in the brain. It's a problem with creating the motor plan for the speech, which is done up in the brain. So people who are dysphasic, they won't be talking at the same rate as they were before. So again, I really want you to understand the difference between dysarthria and dysphasia, so I'll again just say what dysarthria is. So dysarthria, they often will be talking at the same rate as they would have been before the problem occurred. It's just that now their speech is very difficult to understand, it's very slurred, and it's not perfectly formed anymore. Whereas in dysphasia, they won't be talking at the same speed as they previously were, because now the problem is up in the brain. The brain is really struggling to create the motor plans for speech anymore. Yes, maybe the motor plans can be communicated down to the peripheral nervous system perfectly fine if they don't have a dysarthria as well as a dysphasia, but now they can't generate the motor plans in the same way as they could before. So often they will really be struggling to actually find words to say because they're really struggling to create the motor plans for speech. And the motor plans that they do form might not be perfect anymore, and therefore you might again end up with slurred speech and difficult to understand speech, but this time it's a problem with the actual formation of the motor plan, and you can really see people with dysphasia struggling to actually find words effectively. So dysphasia is analogous to dyspraxia. It's a difficulty up in the brain with creating the incredible pattern of action potentials that is necessary to produce speech, rather than the problem just communicating that incredible pattern of action potentials down to the peripheral nervous system, as indeed dysarthria was. Okay, right, so we've gone over sensory, motor, visual, speech symptoms. Next I want to talk about the autonomic symptoms. So just to foreshadow how far this is going to go on, I've got 8 different categories of symptoms that I want to go over. We're now halfway through. We've done sensory, motor, visual and speech. We're now going to do autonomic symptoms, then we'll talk a little bit about cerebellar symptoms, cognitive symptoms and psychiatric symptoms, and then we will have finished the symptoms portion of this video. So we're halfway through. So the next category of symptoms is autonomic symptoms. So this involves something called the autonomic nervous system. So what I will abbreviate down to the ANS. So the autonomic nervous system is part of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So when we talk about the nervous system, we can divide it up hugely into those 2 big categories, central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. But there are also other ways of categorizing up the nervous system. We can categorize it up into the different bits that do different things. So for instance, there is the motor system that controls movement, and this will contain a huge part of the central nervous system that's involved in controlling movement, and it will also involve parts of the peripheral nervous system that are involved, for instance, in communicating the motor plans to the actual muscle cells. So the motor neurons in particular, they're part of the motor system. So what I'm trying to say here is that there are these other ways that we classify the nervous system up. So for instance, the motor system contains parts of both the central and the peripheral nervous system. This thing, the autonomic nervous system, contains parts of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system as well. So, what is the autonomic nervous system? The autonomic nervous system is the system within the nervous system that controls unconscious bodily functions. So there are lots of things in your body that need input from the nervous system. They are under the control of the nervous system. However, you do not consciously control them at all. So things like how fast your heart is beating, that's something that is controlled by the nervous system, but very few people can consciously control how fast their heart is beating. Gut motility, how fast food is being moved through your intestines, that's something that is controlled by the nervous system, but isn't necessarily something that you can consciously control. So these unconscious functions that require nervous system control within the body, these are controlled by the autonomic nervous system. So when you have lesions to the central nervous system, this can affect the autonomic nervous system, because remember, the autonomic nervous system has part in the central nervous system and part in the peripheral nervous system. So you can damage the autonomic nervous system in multiple sclerosis, and this can lead to dysregulation of bodily systems. In particular, the main things that I'm going to talk about are that it can lead to problems with, need the pen, with your bowels, so with the gastrointestinal tract, and also with the bladder. So let's talk about this. So we'll start with bowels firstly. So the autonomic nervous system is very important in controlling the activity of the gastrointestinal tract, the activity in particular of the intestines, so the small intestine and the large intestine, and controlling the movement of contents through the intestines. Now, if you get lesions to parts of the central nervous system that are involved in the autonomic nervous system, this can lead to the movement of contents through the intestines being too slow, and therefore one of the common things that people with multiple sclerosis can experience is constipation. And this is because of the dysfunction of the autonomic nervous system part that's within the central nervous system, and no longer controlling the movement of contents through the intestines correctly anymore. Another thing that we classify as an autonomic symptom, certainly a bowel symptom, but which is a little bit more conscious control, so you might question whether it really should be categorized as being an autonomic symptom, but we do classify it as an autonomic symptom, is that people with multiple sclerosis can also end up with fecal incontinence. So I'll put this here. So they can lose the ability to control when they go to the toilet and empty their bowels. So most of us, of course, can control when we empty our bowels. You know, the intestine might want to empty the bowels, but the brain can say, no, now is not an appropriate moment to actually empty the bowels, and it can inhibit the emptying of the bowels. If you have white matter lesions in the central nervous system, you can imagine that maybe the brain loses its control on the intestines, and therefore the intestines decide to empty in inappropriate times when you're not sitting on the toilet, for instance, and therefore you can end up with fecal incontinence. So these are the two bowel symptoms that you can get with multiple sclerosis. Constipation is a major one that a lot of people with multiple sclerosis end up with, and that's because no longer is the correct signalling going to the intestines to move food through at an appropriate speed. And in more severe cases, of course, you can end up with fecal incontinence, where the brain loses the ability to actually say no to the intestines and stop them emptying the bowels whenever they feel like it. Okay, so now let's go on to bladder symptoms, and bladder symptoms are actually extremely similar to what we've seen here. So constipation is due to too little muscular contraction now in the intestines due to this central damage of the autonomic nervous system, and fecal incontinence is due to no longer being able to control when the intestines are going to empty. And the same sort of things can happen in the bladder. You can end up with too little contraction occurring within the bladder, and this can lead to urinary retention. So I'll put this here. So it can lead to urinary retention, and this is where you don't properly ever empty your bladder. So normally, in a young healthy person, when you go to empty your bladder, you will completely empty all of the urine out of your bladder. Whereas if you've got damage to the autonomic nervous system, the bladder might not contract enough, and therefore you might get urine staying in the bladder even after you've been to try and empty your bladder. And this can build up and up and up and cause the bladder to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and this is called urinary retention when this occurs. You're retaining urine within the urinary bladder. So when you think about it, that's very similar to constipation. It's just a different system that's now being affected. But it's the same kind of thing that's happening. Too little activity is leading to retention. Constipation is effectively fecal retention, and this is urinary retention occurring within the bladder. And then the analogous symptom in the bladder then to fecal incontinence is of course urinary incontinence. So again, the bladder might decide that it wants to empty at any old time, and normally in a young healthy person with a functioning central nervous system, the brain says, don't you dare, this is not an appropriate time for us to empty our bladder, and inhibits the emptying of the bladder. If you have damage to the control mechanisms by which the brain controls the emptying of the bladder and says no, you can imagine then that the bladder might just contract on its own, and then you might end up with urinary incontinence. So urinary incontinence is another symptom that people with multiple sclerosis can suffer with. Okay, so let's just summarise what we've seen as the autonomic symptoms. So the autonomic nervous system, it's a subset of the nervous system that has parts of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system involved, and it is the part of the nervous system that controls non-conscious bodily functions. So it controls the visceral organs, and the ones that we're particularly interested in multiple sclerosis are the fact that it controls the bowels and also the urinary bladder. Now, if you get white matter lesions in the central nervous system, parts that are actually involved in the autonomic nervous system, this can lead to dysfunction of the autonomic nervous system. In particular, it can lead to reduction in the movement of contents through the intestines, which can lead to constipation. It can also lead to too little contraction of the urinary bladder when you actually try to urinate, and therefore you can end up with urinary retention. In addition, of course, normally the central nervous system is controlling when you actually empty your bowels and when you empty your bladder, and if you have problems now with those control mechanisms because of white matter lesions, then you can end up with the bowels and the bladder taking the decision themselves, so you can end up with fecal incontinence and urinary incontinence, I'm afraid. Okay, so those are the autonomic symptoms of multiple sclerosis. Let's go on. So the next one's going to be very short, the cerebellar symptoms. So another colour, we'll go for a little purple colour. So, cerebellar symptoms. So, the cerebellum, and I'll just write out its name here. So, the cerebellum is of course part of the brain. Going back up to my picture of the brain, up here, it's this bit. Underneath the cerebral hemispheres here, you have the cerebellum, the little brain as it's called. Now, what is the cerebellum involved in doing? So let me give you a basic description of what the cerebellum is involved in doing. The cerebellum is actually extremely important in the motor system, in making movements. So where is the cerebellum important in the motor system? It's important in calibrating motor plans. So I have already stressed to you how incredible the motor system is. The brain comes up with these incredible patterns of action potentials that are then, signaled down the brainstem and the spinal cord to the peripheral nervous system to then command the actual muscles of the body to actually make that movement. If you need to make an extremely calibrated movement, an extremely precise movement, that's where the cerebellum is extremely important in modifying motor plans and making sure they're perfect. So, let me give you the archetypal example of this. If you want to catch a ball, then you have to calibrate your movement incredibly well to visual information. Your brain is getting visual information all the time about where the ball is flying. That visual information needs to be used to make a perfect motor plan so that you make the precise movement in order to actually catch this ball. And if that movement's off by even a slight little bit, you might not catch the ball, so you will fail in the task. The cerebellum is important in calibrating the motor plan. It's important in making the motor plan perfect. It's involved in taking in this visual information, taking in the motor plan that's already been drawn up and changing it to make it perfect so that you actually will catch the ball. So normally motor plans are drawn up by the cerebral hemispheres, but the cerebellum looks at the motor plan when it needs to be extremely well calibrated and can make alterations to make it perfect. So let me spell out what's going to happen here. So let's say we're trying to catch a ball. So visual information will come in through the optic nerve and it will go to the back of the cerebral hemispheres to be processed. You will start trying to make this motor plan to actually catch the ball. What will then happen is the visual information and the motor plan will go to the cerebellum, and the cerebellum will say, are we actually going to catch this ball? I'm looking at the visual information, I'm looking at the motor plan that we're going to use to actually move. Will we actually catch the ball if we do this? And it will say either yes or no. If it says no, then it will make little modifications to the motor plan and then send it back up to the cerebral hemispheres, and that motor plan will now be the best attempt we can do, and that motor plan will now go down the brainstem and the spinal cord to be initiated. And of course sometimes the cerebellum gets it wrong, sometimes you don't catch the ball, but then the more and more times you practice catching the ball, the better and better your cerebellum will get at calibrating the motor plans to actually fit the visual information so that you catch the ball. So, the cerebellum is extremely important in calibrating motor plans, making them perfectly coordinated with visual information, and the archetypal example of that is catching a ball. However, you use the cerebellum for much more mundane tasks as well. Just walking along and maintaining your balance. The cerebellum is extremely important in doing that as well, calibrating the motor plan to make sure that you're going to stay balanced. And indeed, if you have lesions to the cerebellum, your movements can become very uncalibrated, uncoordinated. And when someone is suffering with uncoordinated movements, we have a fancy medical term for that. It's called ataxia. So this is the cerebellar symptom that people with multiple sclerosis can get. And this is one of the classical symptoms of multiple sclerosis. If you've ever met someone with multiple sclerosis, this might have been something that you picked up on instantly, that they're very, very unsteady. If they're walking around, they are very, very unbalanced. They're not, they're swaying from side to side. It sounds a little bit mean, but I'm going to say it because it does give a good description. They look a little bit like they're drunk, because when you're alcohol intoxicated, the cerebellum no longer functions as well as it should when you're not alcohol intoxicated, so you do become ataxic when you're drunk. But of course they're not drunk, it's because they've got lesions to the cerebellum that is causing ataxia. So ataxia is the fancy name for uncoordinated, unsteady movements, and this is due to cerebellar lesions. And as I say, I've given you this very, very fancy function of the cerebellum. It's involved in catching balls, but do not think that that's the only function of the cerebellum. The cerebellum calibrates all our motor movements, even just standing up and keeping our balance. The cerebellum's important there. So bad cerebellar function due to white matter lesions will lead to being extremely unsteady and will lead to walking in an extremely unsteady and unbalanced fashion, and that's called ataxia. Okay, right, so we've done sensory symptoms, motor symptoms, visual symptoms, speech symptoms, autonomic symptoms, cerebellar symptoms. We've now got the more mysterious symptoms to go on to, cognitive symptoms and psychiatric symptoms. So cognitive symptoms next. So this is obviously an extremely complicated topic that even if I wanted to explain the neurobiology of this to you, I wouldn't be able to because we don't really understand it properly. So we're now going on to the cognitive symptoms of multiple sclerosis. So what is cognition? So I'll just write it down here. What is cognition? Cognition is the fancy word for thinking, for conscious thinking. Cognitive functions of the brain, any function of the brain that you can pay conscious attention to and which you can really, pay attention to and coordinate in a conscious way, that can be called a cognitive function. So think of all the incredible things that your brain does, anything that you can actually pay conscious attention to, anything that you can think about, that can be thought of as a cognitive symptom. And of course, we don't really understand cognition properly. I don't know even in my lifetime whether we're going to acquire a proper understanding of cognition. We don't understand what consciousness is, but we all do have an innate sense of what consciousness is because we are all conscious. So any function of the brain that can have conscious attention, that can have thinking directed onto it, can be called a cognitive function. So let me list some examples of cognitive functions. So processing sensory information. So sensory processing. So for instance, if someone's talking to you, you're getting a load of sensory information, a load of auditory information coming in. That then needs to be processed, and you actually need to work out what that person is saying. You can certainly put conscious effort into processing sensory information. You can certainly put conscious effort into processing auditory information, but you can also put conscious effort into processing visual information, or indeed tactile information. All the different sensory modalities you can consciously focus on processing, and therefore the processing of sensory information to work out, for instance, what someone is saying to you, that is considered a cognitive function because it's something that you can actually think about. Okay, so sensory processing is a cognitive function, and indeed all of these things, the reason I'm going over all of these, of course, is because they can go wrong in multiple sclerosis. If you've got white matter lesions up in your cerebral hemispheres, you can lose the ability to do these things. You can lose the ability to understand what people are saying to you because auditory processing has been damaged by a white matter lesion. So all of these cognitive functions, they can go wrong in multiple sclerosis. Another big cognitive function is, of course, memory. So being able to remember things, that is certainly something that you can put conscious attention into. All medical students are very aware that you can put conscious attention into trying to remember things. So memory is also a cognitive function. Being able to remember what happened yesterday, or also being able to remember who the monarch of England was in 1598 or whatever. All of these things, those are a cognitive function. Memory is a cognitive function. Okay, so sensory processing, memory, these are cognitive functions. Making decisions, decision making, this is a cognitive function. Of course, you can put conscious attention into decision making, you can think about it, so it's a cognitive function. So even things like just deciding what you're going to have for breakfast, this is a cognitive function. And indeed, if you get lesions to certain portions of the white matter of your brain, you can lose the ability to make decisions. So all of these things can go wrong in multiple sclerosis. And the final major cognitive function that I'll put here that we've actually already talked about is motor plans. Coming up with motor plans. You can concentrate on coming up with motor plans. You can concentrate on moving. For instance, when you're trying to do a very fine movement, maybe you're trying to dance, or indeed if you're trying to catch a ball, you can consciously concentrate on that. You can think about it. Therefore, it is a cognitive function. So dyspraxia is, if you like, a cognitive symptom. I put it with the motor symptoms because, of course, it's majorly part of the motor system, but you could also put it as a cognitive symptom of multiple sclerosis. So these are four major cognitive functions of the brain: processing sensory information, remembering sensory information, making decisions about what to do next, and then making motor plans to actually enact your decisions. All of these things are cognitive functions. They can all go wrong within multiple sclerosis, so you can get problems with sensory processing of all the different sensory modalities. You can get problems with memory, you can get problems with making decisions, and you can get problems, of course, with making motor plans, and we've discussed the fancy term for that, it's dyspraxia. Okay, so those are the cognitive symptoms of multiple sclerosis. And, of course, I'm not giving you a proper explanation as to how cognition works because we don't have a proper explanation as to how cognition works, but hopefully you can understand that if you do get lesions to parts of your brain, you would be able to lose these functions if the part of the brain that was affected was involved in doing this. Okay, and next, final category of symptoms are what we call the psychiatric symptoms. And these are problems with mood, problems with anxiety, and also problems with psychotic symptoms. So let me put those 3 different categories of psychiatric symptoms. So there are 3 major categories of psychiatric symptoms. There are mood symptoms, there are anxiety symptoms, and then there are the psychotic symptoms. So we'll start off with mood symptoms. So people with multiple sclerosis, if you get lesions in certain portions of the brain, this can lead to problems with the regulation of your mood, with the regulation of how happy and how energetic you are. And this can go one of 2 ways. So either you can end up, of course, with very low mood, or you can end up with different types of mood symptoms. You can end up potentially with very high moods. So the 2 major types of mood disorder then are, of course, you can end up with depression, which is low mood and low energy. So you don't feel good at all, and you also don't really feel like doing anything. So it's important to put both of those there, that depression doesn't just involve low mood, it also involves the low energy, the not wanting to do anything, the just wanting to stay inside and do nothing. So low mood and low energy is depression. The other major mood symptom that can occur is mania. Now, in mania, we can split mania into 2 different types of mania. There is the depressive mania, and then there is the euphoric mania. And I think it's very important to make the distinction between these 2 different types of mania, because when people think of mania, they think of euphoric mania rather than depressive mania. However, euphoric mania is quite rare. I've not met many people with euphoric mania. Most people who have mania have depressive mania. So let me just explain what the difference between them is. So in depressive mania, you end up with extremely high energy but extremely low mood. So that's what mania is really all about. Mania is about very high energy. It's not necessarily about having high mood. And in depressive mania, they end up still with a low mood, but they end up with a very high energy. So contrast that to depression. In depression, you have very low mood and very low energy. In depressive mania, you still have very low mood, but you have very high energy now. Whereas in euphoric mania, of course, there you actually end up with very, very high mood and very, very high energy. But that is a rarer type of mood disorder to actually occur. The more common type of manic episode is the depressive manic episode, where individuals get an incredible amount of energy, so they no longer want to sleep, they no longer want to lie down and just relax. They'll stay up potentially all night writing things, but they are miserable, even though they've got that incredibly high amount of energy. And depressive manic episodes can be extremely dangerous because the individuals are extremely low mood, they're not feeling good at all, and they've got extremely high energy, so the rate of suicide can be very high in people with depressive manic episodes because they've got a lot of energy, so they can actually go and try and kill themselves, whereas people with depression, where they've got very low mood and very low energy, they just can't be, they're less likely to actually commit suicide because they haven't got the energy to actually go out and do what needs to be done to commit suicide. So depressive manic episodes are extremely dangerous. So people with multiple sclerosis, you can get mood disorders. Depression is obviously a major mood disorder, but also be aware that mania can occur, and there are these 2 different types of mania, depressive mania and euphoric mania. And euphoric mania, although that's the one that's famous, it's very rare to see someone with euphoric mania. Okay, so anxiety symptoms, of course, this is symptoms of worrying. So being anxious and stressed all the time. This can occur due to lesions in certain portions of the brain as well that dysregulate the fear response. And then let's go on to the psychotic symptoms. So the psychotic symptoms are the symptoms of schizophrenia, the major positive symptoms of schizophrenia. And there are two major classes of psychotic symptoms, namely hallucinations and delusions. So we'll talk about hallucinations first, and then we'll go on to talk about delusions. So hallucinations are where you perceive a sensory stimulus that is not actually present. So you can have visual hallucinations, which is where you see things that aren't actually there. You can have auditory hallucinations, which is where you hear voices that aren't actually there, or you hear other things that aren't actually there. Or you can even have tactile hallucinations, which is where you feel things that aren't there. People can describe, for instance, feeling as though there are bugs within their body, things like that, and they can actually feel these bugs moving around in their body, and that's an example of a tactile hallucination where it's somatosensory stimulation that is being perceived as occurring, which isn't actually there. Okay, so hallucinations can occur. Delusions then. Delusions are where people start believing things that cannot possibly be true. So you believe bizarre things that can't be explained by your cultural or religious backgrounds, that cannot possibly be true. So people might, for instance, start believing that the security services are after them. That would be an example of a paranoid delusion. Or they might believe that they've been kidnapped by aliens, or they might believe that they are living within the Truman Show. So the Truman Show was a film years ago which was about a man named Truman who his entire life was artificial, effectively. He was actually the star of a television show, and they built a massive, great studio that he was living in, and he was completely unaware of this. He'd been brought up in this studio from a child, and every moment of his life is filmed, and all the people around him are actors and actresses, and everything's fake. And the film follows him realising that everything's fake, realising that he's in this massive, great set, and then eventually escaping from it. So people can end up believing that they are indeed within the Truman Show. So bizarre, insane beliefs that cannot be justified by cultural or religious backgrounds, and which cannot be talked out of the people suffering with them. So you can't try and have a logical conversation and actually cause them to change their mind about this. You can't convince them otherwise. It's a fixed belief that you can't get rid of, that has suddenly occurred. Okay, so those are psychotic symptoms, hallucinations and delusions. So, again, lesions to certain white matter areas within the brain can lead to these sort of symptoms actually occurring. So, to summarise the psychiatric symptoms, so there are three major categories of psychiatric symptoms: mood symptoms, anxiety symptoms, and psychotic symptoms. Mood symptoms, if you get lesions to certain areas of the brain, you can get dysregulated mood. This can either lead to you becoming depressed, where you've got extremely low mood and extremely low energy, or it can lead to you becoming manic, which is where you've got very high energy. There are two different forms of mania. Depressive mania, which is where your mood is very low, but your energy, of course, is very high. And euphoric mania, which is where your energy is very high and your mood is very high. And in my experience, depressive mania is the more common type of mania than euphoric mania. Anxiety symptoms are, of course, excessive worry and stress, and this is due to dysregulation of the fear system within the central nervous system. And again, we can understand how if you've got lesions to parts of white matter that regulate the fear response, you could end up with it being permanently on, and therefore anxiety symptoms. And then finally, the psychotic symptoms, of which there are two major categories: hallucinations, which is where you perceive sensory stimuli that are not there, and delusions, which is where you start believing something that you did not believe previously, which cannot be true, and which cannot be justified by your cultural or religious backgrounds. And these beliefs cannot be shaken no matter how long someone talks to you and tries to talk reason and logic into you. They cannot be shaken. And these are what we call psychotic symptoms in psychiatry. And again, you can understand how lesions to the brain could lead to you hallucinating, could lead to you developing delusional beliefs. Okay, brilliant. So we have now finished the great big long list of potential symptoms that people with multiple sclerosis can suffer with. As I said at the start of this video, this is a great big long list of symptoms. An individual with multiple sclerosis will not have every single one of these symptoms. They will have a collection of them. And the ones that they have will of course depend on where the lesions within their central nervous system have actually formed. So we'll have a break here. In the next video we'll finish our introductory bit by going over the epidemiology of multiple sclerosis and a little bit about the classification of the types of multiple sclerosis, and after that we'll move on to discuss pathophysiology.